what was most rewarding was every day, Sergeant Major and I walked that fence line every day. Every night before we went to lay down, I won't say to the hotel because that didn't happen all the time. So before we lay down somewhere, we would walk the fence line. And I will tell you that senior leadership presence matters, because senior leadership who didn't want to be named or who didn't want to, but they would show up and say, John Birckhead, can I walk that line tonight? And they would walk around saying hello to soldiers. I know sometimes soldiers probably didn't even know who they were talking to, right? So, but that was important, that senior leadership at the highest levels would do that.
Welcome back to Leaders Recon. Today we're having a capstone episode on our domestic operations series where we're going to talk about, what domestic operations look like in practice. And to talk about that is Brig Gen Janeen Birckhead, the Army commander for the Maryland National Guard, but also the Capital Task Force Commander?
Task Force Commander.
During the large mobilization that we had following the January 6th incident.
That's correct. That's correct.
Oh, ma'am, welcome to the program.
Thank you. Glad to be here, and glad to be here on the capstone event to bring this to closure where we started and a few months ago, and back here with you now.
I know, so it's actually the second time you've been on the podcast. When we first kind of stood up the podcast, I think it was literally episode 1 or 2. We were like, hey, what do we want to talk about? And I think we talked a little bit about the COVID response that you were at the time planning. I guess kind of coming back to that before we dive into domestic operations, how did that go?
Well, it went very well. And I think that is really probably the epitome of one of the domestic operations where the National Guard in total did very well. But also Maryland, we did extremely well in responding to what we call COVID-1, COVID-2, COVID-3, where we stood up testing, and we stood up the vaccination clinics, and then we stood up the Vaccine Equity Task Force that worked in underserved communities with the homeless, with the unhoused population.
Oh, wow.
So we did really well, I believe, and we were recognized in some of the nation's journals for our work around vaccine equity.
What do you think was really some of the keys to your success for being so,
So we were community oriented. We realized that we are in support of civil authorities, as we are in any domestic operation, which is very important. And then what the National Guard does best, we can operationalize with a plan. So we had a plan. We were able to bring that plan to fruition using the resources provided, in addition to working very closely with the state. Have to do that. And then when the plan needed to change, when conditions changed, again, what the Army does well, we changed our plan, and then we reattacked.
Really? I mean, yeah, it's I feel because you heard a lot about people being on orders for really long periods of time, but you guys, didn't you basically shut down everything and then returned it all back on again in short order?
That's very correct. That is absolutely correct. Well, it's also important to remember, while we were doing these operations, as with all of the other states, we were still doing our federal mission. So it never totally got turned off. The machine kept running. Under there was a federal operation running. The state continued to run and do what it needed to do. And then you have this domestic response to COVID that was ongoing to ensure that, people got fed. Grocery stores, if you remember, were closed.
Oh, yeah.
So we were actually on the streets feeding people. We were using whether it was aviation assets or vehicles, communication, getting into schools and helping teachers when it was time. All those things were brought to bear during COVID. And I think we did a very good job at doing that. And then on top of that, the Vaccine Equity Task Force. It was the first in the nation operational Vaccine Equity Task Force. And what I mean by that is that we studied the problem, but then we actually created a plan and specific metrics based on what Maryland looks like to get after vaccine equity in those communities that needed that extra attention.
Well, I mean, really, what we're talking about right now kind of was what I hope to ask you a little bit about, which was hey, before we go into the Capital Task Force and the January 6th mobilization, what was your experience working in domestic operations over the course of your career? Did you have some exposure early on in your career?
Yes, absolutely. So I've been in for a little bit, so we couldn't miss a snowstorm here or there, all right? We've gotten better at that over time as the environment has changed, of course. But we had Freddie Gray, just before COVID, and that was an experience that also helped to prepare
And
the
what is that,
organization.
just for?
So the Freddie Gray was killed in Baltimore, and there was civil unrest in Baltimore, and the community being trusting of the National Guard, we were able to deploy to the streets of Baltimore without incidents and quell and help bring down the tensions in the community. But we couldn't have done that. You ask, what do we do early? We get out into the community and we make connections. And it's just not with our politicians and our public leadership. It's with the people and communities that matter, and knowing those people who can make a difference in the community.
And like, speaking of that, like leadership piece and like working in conjunction with those local communities, like, is that something that you saw like as a company grade or, you know, young field grade officer, that you were able to apply later on here? Like, when did you kind of like see that, like, and it became like a thing that you're like, hey, this is going to be a principle of mine when I take senior leader role?
So I will tell you that fortunately it was always a principle of mine, and that was because I had some very good mentors coming up. Former Adjutant General, one of the longest serving, General Frederick, was very much about the community and getting into the community and understanding the community. That's why it was so important for us to have armories in the community. So very early on, that was very important to me, and the career, understanding in my career that would be important to be successful. And it's played out to be very true.
So obviously you mentioned like you've been in some, you know, you have some of the snowstorms, you had the domestic response here. When did you find out like, hey, you were tapped to be the task force commander for the mobilization that was happening as January 6th unfolded?
Yes. So I was on battlefield circulation, out visiting units. I was actually in with the brigade commander. And of course, we'd seen what happened on TV earlier that day, and we're monitoring. And I get a call to say, "Are you watching this?" "Yes, sir, I'm watching it. I am watching it." "Okay, I just need you to make sure you're watching it," because we're so close to DC. We're thinking that obviously we're going to be called to assist if needed. So as the day went on and as the day proceeded, I did have conversations with General Walker at the time, the commanding general in DC, who says, "I need you to come in. I need you to come and help. We're going to need you." Absolutely. We need all those behind the scenes coordinations that have to be done at the highest levels were being done. This is a warno, right? That you need to be prepared. Got it, sir.
So, yeah, what was that like? What was your first action then, like that you kind of took?
So my first action was to check with the team. Like, who do I have available? Who can stand up within the next 24 to 48 hours? Who can I have on duty? So I'm checking with my brigade commanders, and of course, continuously planning. We always have our, commander's readiness brief. I can pull that out at a moment's notice. But who can I touch today? And then, of course, we have our quick response team that's always on duty. So, or always supposed to be prepared to respond, even though we're traditional guardsmen. And so those were my first touch points. Well, let me back up. My first touch point was to my sergeant major. Okay, that was truly my first touch point. Sergeant major, let me just tell you what might be going on. And so that was my first touch point, because really on the ground, he's going to be reaching out to the sergeants majors to say, hey, who's ready? You need to make sure that you have an idea about who you can bring.
What was kind of going through your mind? Like, just like when you know what I mean? Like, obviously there's a lot of stuff going on, but like just from a leadership perspective, like, at the time didn't probably know what the scope of it was going to be or anything, but like, what was that feeling like, and like, what were you thinking?
This isn't real. Like this is gonna calm down. This is gonna subside, maybe. And then as the day progressed and calls started to be made, I realized that we were gonna have to put somebody on the ground and pretty quickly. So Maryland was the first in to DC, and the soldiers were ready easily. Within 8 hours, we had soldiers rolling in, and were prepared to go. Which is important. And as the discussion progressed throughout the evening, it was a decision for us to come in very early the next morning. And so realizing we're planners, right? We're planners. We understand that coming into a situation that was very fluid. We had to be really ready to sustain ourselves because the District of Columbia and the DC National Guard, truly, they're not going to be prepared to sustain us. They're just having the same experience. And so we came in that first day. How can we help? Where do we need to go? What do we need to do? And having that experience with General Walker made him realize quickly that I can't do this with my staff alone. I'm going to need some additional leadership here. What is it that you recommend, General Birckhead? And so we had some recommendations, and then he's like, can you be the task force commander? You know, one of the questions that I get sometimes or I hear is like, well, why General Birckhead? Well, General Birckhead has worked on the Hill for several years. I was an intern, a high school page.
Really?
Way back in the day. I know the Capitol Hill grounds like the back of my hand, right? I know the tunnels, I know. And as I said, I've worked on the Hill. I know legislators, which was really important. And I'm a general officer. And it was funny, the other day I was in a briefing and a general officer said, "You're a general officer, what does that mean?" You're a general officer, you can do anything, you know? So,
Yeah.
and we're trained to be able to respond. And I think that those are some of the things that I was able to bring to bear. My training, my relationships, we talked about relationships, my ability to bring a group of people together.
Well, that's what I was getting ready to ask about. Like, how did you go about like forming your team? So now you
Right.
officially get notified, like, yeah, can you be the task force commander? And then, kind of what did you do to build that initial staff?
Yes, so beyond Sergeant Major, first call, and then understanding that in this scenario, public affairs is very important, but certainly authorities and the staff judge advocate was very important initially. Like, who do I need? And then interoperability. How do we communicate? We have the Capitol Hill Police, who we embedded with on a different frequency, different system, the marshals, the District of Columbia Police, the National Capitol Police, the Park and Planning Police. You know, you have the FBI, the CIA, you have all
every
these
agency's
agencies,
there,
right?
yeah.
You have all these agencies, and we do plan to work together, but not at this sort of scale. So how does interoperability work, and how are we going to be able to talk and then use the same language, of course? So it was important to build a team that was able to work in that uncertain environment and to be able to understand the sensitivities around working with so many different institutions of our government.
That's what I was going to ask. Like, what are some of those like either traits that you specifically were looking for when you thought of like, hey, people you're tapping to do?
Right. So someone who could understand, when I say understand the climate, look around, read the room, understanding we're not the smartest and we're not going to have all the answers. Who am I going to go to who may have the answer, and how can I quickly build trust, and help them help me to get the answer. I will tell you that was one of the things when I talk about interoperability. We had a lack of the ability to communicate across radios. So we had soldiers carrying 2 and 3 radios initially. That wasn't very good, right?
Yeah.
We were not very. How do you do that? So the G6 at the J6, my J6 at Guard Bureau. Again, relationships. He was able to get in there, work with Capitol Police after we brought him in, working with the different authorities that we have to be able to get a network up and running and identify space for that within a time period we were there, which is huge because we hadn't done that before. So that was one of the ways that we were able to work together.
So once you start getting on the ground like that, you're talking about like a lot of this interoperability, which was a big part of what I was kind of curious about, because we had a whole episode on this where we talked like working with interagency partners, but obviously this is at a wholly different scale. How did that serve? Like, so you're all of a sudden you're a task force commander, but you have all these other agencies that don't report to you, but now you're, I'm assuming you have LNOs at all these places. Like, how important do those LNOs come, and like how did you kind of like synchronize, the National Guard efforts with everyone's, individual agenda and individual requirements that are coming from their senior leaders? So.
Well, I must say that, and I give the National Guard, big National Guard, a pat on the back, because there wasn't a soldier who came in who said, I'm not following General Birckhead's lead, or I'm not following the directions of the CG for the DC National Guard. It was very clear that they came in professionally to all of us working towards the same goal, and that was to ensure the peaceful transfer of power when we had the inauguration, right? So everybody was clear about that. And so the LNOs were really instructive. They were able to decode, if you will, some of the language. Well, what is it that you really want us to do? And let us make some recommendations about how we can best employ our people. Is it really that you want us standing shoulder to shoulder for every 5 feet? Or is it that you want this area covered with intersecting fires, if you will? So, and then explaining authorities. When we talk about our personal protection of ourselves and how we can respond, whether we're inside the gate or outside the gate mattered. So we had to have that liaison to be able to communicate with somebody inside the fence, Capitol Hill Police, somebody outside the fence, depends on what fence you were standing on, because it could be a different authority, it could be a different police force, it could be a different law enforcement agency, and having to have those conversations back and forth to understand what we could and could not do was very important. As far as synchronization, the team we met, we had stand up in the morning and we had a debrief in the evening every day, every day. The commanders at the different task force levels were in constant contact about what they were seeing and what was going on.
How did you structure that? So like obviously, I knew you were the task force commander, but like eventually, I mean, how many soldiers did you at the peak have?
There were 15,000.
Yeah, that's what I thought. I thought it was like
a division
pretty
size element.
Yeah, very
That's
large
correct.
organization.
Yes.
So like, how did you structure that
Yes.
command chain? Because I mean, you're working with people who never worked together at all. I mean, you got soldiers from all over the country
That's
coming in. Like,
That's
I
right.
mean, how did you handle that?
So that is our strength, right? We had, we're 54 entities. At the basic level, we're soldiers. So there's an understanding that there has to be a chain of command. And the way that I looked at it was Task Force Capital proper, the Senate, the Capitol, the House, the Library of Congress, the Supreme Court, and then some ancillary buildings around it, the power plant. How best to divide that up and ensure that each area was covered and someone had responsibility. So at a tactical level, that's what I did. And I'm being very familiar with the layout of the land, was able to, and again, the National Guard has its strengths in that we work in communities, bring in a soldier who had studied and worked on the plan for DC response and knew some of the things that we could bring to bear as far as moving people in and out, should we have to do evacuation, things like that. Those, we were planning to that level of detail because it hadn't been exercised to that extent. Like, how do you integrate the National Guard into that if they have an encampment on the Hill? How does that work?
Well, a lot of people were super skeptical in the public sector and like other agencies on like whether we'd be able to mobilize that quickly. But I mean, as you mentioned, right? I mean, 15,000 people within very short period of time, like obviously huge logistical strain with that.
Correct.
What can you talk a little bit about that and like how you what struggles you ran into and then like how you solved some of them?
Yes. So you can imagine we're trying to bring people in by bus, train, plane, automobile. Right? We're using everything. Soldiers are flowing into Andrews. Soldiers are coming in through bus. And it was a strain on the DC National Guard, who was running logistics to get that operation up and running, right? How do you feed, house, clothe that many people in that short a time? And I must say that with the addition of the contracting of the Guard Bureau and with DC, they were able to put contracts in place very quickly. We had every hotel from Capitol Hill to Bethesda out in Maryland. But the challenge with that is that how do you move people in a timely manner to respond to what we were supposed to respond to?
With DC traffic, right?
Exactly. Well, we didn't have any traffic to deal with. We were creating the traffic, right? We were creating the traffic to a large extent. But that just to to make that, traverse that period, to traverse that, that much land in that short a period of time, should you need to respond within a period, right? How does that work? So we had to make sure that while we were allowing soldiers that rest work cycle, that we also had enough soldiers on the ground to meet the needs of our partner, what the DC government or DC police, what they wanted us to do, what the leadership on Capitol Hill was expecting of us. And so that had to be addressed. And so then you get things like, where does soldiers stay? And how do they respond?
And did you lean heavily on like that team that you originally built to put that together? Or?
I did. I relied heavily on the team, working with the District of Columbia's or DC National Guard, working very closely with their logistics team. So part of my team, in addition to public affairs and legal, was a logistics cell, was a comm cell, a G6. Our logistics cell worked very closely with the DC Guard to ensure that we were getting the buses and the transportation and all those things worked out. And when there were gaps in that swing, how do we fulfill those gaps? And of course, we had to get creative in some instances to make sure the soldier was taken care of.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like, I can't imagine like the amount of like just with all the agencies involved, like how much of your time was getting sucked up just trying to work with other agencies. Like, how did you balance, managing this team that you put together? But I mean, you're basically like pseudo division commander, right? Division size element. Mm-hmm. But then you're also have all these partner organizations and like a bunches of LNOs that you're running through. Like, how did you manage your time dealing with all of that?
So it was long days, right? So long days. First of all, was making sure that everyone knew what I knew to the extent that it was appropriate. That information sharing had to happen consistently and throughout the day. And then making sure that, I mentioned authorities, making sure that we were reminding the team every day about authorities and what our role was and how we interplayed with support to civil authorities in support of. Those were constant messages and themes. And then to balance the day with that messaging to make sure we were where you wanted us to be, we were doing what was appropriate. I had lots of people within my official chain of command and my unofficial chain of command who were interested in what we were doing, but making sure that I'm responding to the right people with the right information, with the correct information.
I was going to say, how did you handle some of that? Because obviously you've got, I have friends who are, congressmen and stuff who were like stopped in to see soldiers, or like you got Secretary of the Army. I mean, you have all you have Chief of Staff. Like, you have all these people that are like in the DMV. How did you work that?
So we had a constant flow of people who were interested in what the National Guard was doing, right? And which is good, because it was I will say that's good. We had an opportunity for members of Congress who may not have taken the time to connect with the soldier at that level ever. So now you get to see your soldier in action in DC. And so, that in essence was an opportunity to make a connection you may never made, to build relationships and to see the soldier in action. And the protocol public affairs cell was very busy managing that, because while it was their house and we were on Capitol Hill, they were very mindful of, you just can't show up, right? And so we were able to put out guidance and direction about, if you're coming for a visit, if you want to connect, this is what we need you to do. And, for the most part, they were very mindful and respectful of that, understanding that we were there for a mission. And so that was good.
Did you get pulled into a lot of high-profile briefings?
Oh, absolutely.
Really
lots of conversations, lots of briefings. But what was most rewarding was every day, Sergeant Major and I walked that fence line every day. Every night before we went to lay down, I won't say to the hotel because that didn't happen all the time. So before we lay down somewhere, we would walk the fence line. And I will tell you that senior leadership presence matters, because senior leadership who didn't want to be named or who didn't want to, but they would show up and say, John Birckhead, can I walk that line tonight? And they would walk around saying hello to soldiers, I know sometimes soldiers probably didn't even know who they were talking to, right? So, but that was important that senior leadership at the highest levels would do that.
You know, you kind of, we talked a little bit. I mean, I think when you first said you put the team together, right? You talked about you grabbed public affairs and you grabbed legal, and that was one of the questions I really was kind of curious about. Like, obviously, with all of the various understanding what the guard can and can't do, and like kind of the intricacies of that, like how important was legal to have with you, and like what were some of the things that you dealt with that you could use as like an example of success, I guess.
Legal is very important, your SJA, and I think at any level that's important to, from a captain and company command to the highest levels of generalship. You're going to know that your legal staff and is going to give you the right answer, an answer that's ethically sound and uses their proper authority and gives you the right and left limits, and that's important to listen to that. And so that's why, particularly dealing with civil authorities, of course, they're going to bring their legal to the table. And we had those very, I will say, heated at times discussions with the, I would say, like, for instance, Capitol Police, not understanding our authorities and what we can and cannot do. Why can't you just do that? No, that's not how that works. But we could maybe help you coordinate with the proper authorities, or play that intermediary role as an L&O to make sure you're connected with the right people who could do that, whatever it was. And so instead of me getting myself into a situation where I'm talking about something that I'm not sure of, I have my legal staff to turn to say, I need you to look into this and then come back with your best legal advice so that we can pass this on to our civil partners, or what is it that we want to do in this instance. And so that was a daily task and a daily conversation to do that, and very important.
What would you say like one of the biggest challenges was that you faced here, in this specific kind of scenario, and how did you overcome that challenge?
I would say the biggest challenge is being and responding to everyone who has different interests. And I think that it's important, particularly as a young leader, to understand what the mission is, what the goals are, what your leadership is telling you, that this is where we're going and this is why, understanding that, so you can drive to that mission. You can get pulled off of that task, particularly when you have people with so many competing interests. And so if you begin to get sidetracked, that can be very bad for you. So I think that understanding, well, what is our mission here, communicating that down to the lowest level, I think that probably was the biggest challenge. Because as you can see in this situation, we've got the senators, we've got congressmen, we've got the Capitol Hill Police, we've got the Capitol proper, who has its own structure, we've got the Supreme Court, Library of Congress. You've got so many different entities, and they may not all have the same
Yeah, no, I mean, and
goals.
even within the Guard, right? Like, so that's what I was kind of wondering, like, so, we did an episode as part of this series on training and preparing for, doing a domestic operation that's like, it's not a metal task. It's not like I'm like, oh yeah,
Respond to the Capitol.
I'm a T on on responding to COVID or whatever. So how did what are some of the things that you saw from units that came in that you were like, oh, they were really successful and like able to really be implemented, and then others that were maybe weaker? Like, what were the kind of driving differences between those types of units?
Well, we talk about legal, and rules of engagement are important, and having an understanding about what a rule of engagement is and how that works was really helpful. If I had soldiers who I understand, I kind of got that, so what are they here, as opposed to soldiers who may not have even thought of what a rule of engagement is and how I can respond. That was important, and that's a matter of your legal giving a brief to the soldiers and having that happen probably annually, right? So that they understand. Particularly Freddie Gray, rules of engagement were different, but we need to make sure that we're always reminding and providing updated guidance. Our rules of engagement were updated during the DC mission, and always providing that consistent communication. But also, at a basic level, we want to make sure our soldiers can shoot, have been to the range, because that is a risk as a leader that you're going to take if you put somebody on the line who hasn't been to the range. So an assessment of who is not qualified on their weapon was really important. So during the DC mission, we sent people to the range by the hundreds to fire to ensure.
Really?
Yes, because it's important, right? We're expected to be proficient in our weapons. If there was a mishap, then the first thing that somebody's going to say, well, when was the last time you fired that weapon, right? So we needed to ensure that that was the case, and I needed to ensure that I can see on a piece of paper that these soldiers were prepared. So that was an important to me. Yeah.
So, as we kind of talk the back end of it now, so like obviously you hit the climax, it's slowly dwindled down on forces. When you started to look into like some of your after action reviews and like, hey, what can we learn from what we just went through here, which is, as far as I'm tracking, one of the largest, major muscle movements for the National Guard across the country, as far as mobilizing a large number of people in a really rapid period of time. What were some of the big takeaways that you, from your perspective as the task force commander?
So I would say, one of the things that we talk about in domestic operations is understanding critical infrastructure. Right? It would have been helpful for everyone to have an idea walking in the door. This is a critical infrastructure, Capitol Hill proper, and it came together, and but it was after different liaisons and discussing about what is critical infrastructure here and what is it that we're here to protect. That kind of thing. Knowing that, going in and having that coordination would be really important. So I would say that was a good one. I talked about interoperability. That certainly was important. Making sure that you are maintaining your records and keeping a record of what you do, like the RUF. We knew we needed to update our RUF, our rules of engagement. At some point, making sure that we were able to pivot, change those rules of engagement, and get that out to the force. And making sure that we were in coordination with the other agencies if there was some limitation on running a certain mission or practicing something, then we need to know what that is. Let me give you, for instance, working in the District of Columbia, I talked about the different authorities, depending on where you are on a street, maybe changes. Having an understanding of that was critically important, and then being able to communicate that, because if you wanted to have an emergency evacuation on one route, it would be talking to a different entity. On another route, it's talking to another entity. Working out airspace. If we need to evacuate an airspace, and we know that we have our shield in DC, right? That's out, that the National Guard for years has, the shield, protective shield over. What does that look like, and how are we in and out and communicating to ensure that we're able to medevac and get in and get out? And so all of those types of things were.
So it's a lot of stuff that comes together.
It was a lot of stuff. Constant negotiations, constantly having those discussions and planning. Constantly planning.
Yeah, it's like, there's just so many facets to it,
There
right?
is. Yeah.
One of the things that we had kind of talked about a little bit before the podcast, you were talking about like understanding the differences between like authorities with domestic operations and Homeland Response and Homeland Security. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So I find that we talk about DISCA or Homeland Security. We kind of talk about it in the same vein, but and I want to make sure I'm getting this right. Homeland Defense, the SecDef will usually Homeland Defense as opposed to DISCA operations, and we're talking about maybe a support to civil authorities or support to fire weather, something like that, and then the home support in the homeland. Where we're talking about the when there is a a threat of terrorism or things like that. So different authorities, and they have some different meaning.
In like talking about these different organizations, right, and like the authorities that go with that, you've already mentioned a lot of the police type entities that you worked with on an ongoing basis with some of the day-to-day operations. Was there, when it came to like supporting all the soldiers that there and the logistics side of things, like were there other government agencies that you found yourselves working with at the task force level? And if so, like what were those agencies and how did you facilitate some of those support?
Yeah. For me, from a logistics standpoint, I would say the agencies that we found ourselves working with mostly was back to state agencies, right,
Okay.
to support. And
Makes sense.
yes, it's how can I get you to help me to support your soldier more quickly? And so I'll use Maryland for instance. We reached back for support of different kinds of equipment, going back to the PFO to make sure they talk PFO to PFO. How do we do that? Is that good? Is there agreement? Can we bring in this equipment? How do we do that?
Roger.
And those types of specific authorities, looking at that.
So it was less like more working with the states, less
Correct.
like you weren't going to FEMA or you weren't going to.
Correct.
Yeah, okay.
Correct. As opposed to with COVID response, and we're working with FEMA, or we're working with HHS, or we're working with Health and Human Services, or we're working with the different departments of health throughout a state, which we had to coordinate on a daily basis.
Which I think that kind of highlights though something that we were kind of talking about, which is like, hey, like domestic operations can happen at different echelons, and depending on what echelon you're at, it really depends on like who your partners are and like who you are working with to do that
That's
support
right.
to civil authorities.
That's right. And then you bring up who it is, matters who we send in, particularly as an LNO. COVID operations, the LNOs, really good planners, who's got statistical background, some statisticians, who are medical professionals who've done this type of thing before, or who know something about the medical profession, our 68 whiskeys, who can provide a shot, our mental health professionals, looking at, as opposed to in DC, and in response to January 6th, it was planners, operators, communicators, a little different.
Yeah.
But in the National Guard, we had those skill sets, and that was important.
Yeah, I was going to say that. Was there any unique scenarios? I think you already mentioned one when you were talking about like someone who had worked on some of the plans for capital response. But like, were there any unique scenarios where you had National Guardsmen with those civilian backgrounds that really helped play a role in the Task Force Capital?
Oh, absolutely. I would say on a daily basis, working with the different agencies, that's your civilian job. You're like, oh, let me make sure that they know we're here and that we're here to help, right? And then to have that on the ground communication. But you know what it also builds? It builds trust, because we come in with a trusted agent to be able to talk whatever it is, that language of that agency.
Did you use a lot of LNOs that were from the agencies that they were LNOing with?
We tried to,
Okay.
yes. Who knows who can go over and talk to. That was really important. And we tried to partner those agencies as much as possible to do that communication. Yeah.
It's super interesting. I guess before we close up here, like, do you have some pieces of advice you just want to give to like, specifically related to NOMOPS, but like really anything related to this that you want to give to, young company grade officers or soldiers that are still trying to, build up into these more senior roles?
Right. I would say that you have to communicate up and down, and you have to communicate clearly so that everyone understands the intent, so that I know when I have 15,000 soldiers in such a high profile environment, that we all understand and we're moving towards the same goal and objective. And I think so. Communication is very important. Making sure that your leadership team is read in on what the mission is, who to communicate to, and so in case you're not available or something happens to you, making sure that communication up and down the chain and across is very important. I would say that understanding your authorities. So when you're on a mission or you're going to launch on a mission, is it something that we're doing for SPP and you're going overseas, or is it something that you're doing locally? Are you in a Title 32 status? Are you on a state active duty? It matters. And so understanding that matters, so you don't get yourself trouble there. So the authorities matter, understanding that. And then I would say connect with your SJA, connect with your public affairs, and make sure you're on one accord, moving out ethically on anything that you do. And then presence. Presence matters. Make sure you're showing up, being there for your soldiers, that you're in the fight, or that you're helping, that you're working, growing, learning with them, because as a leader, you're not going to know everything, but there's a lot you can know and there's a lot you can learn, and particularly from National Guard soldiers. They might be a private, but they might be in private industry, CEO of a data corporation, and that can be the pivot that you need just to make you more successful, right?
Yeah. No, I mean, it sounds like, if I'm going to summarize it from what I'm hearing, right, it's like you're talking really heavily on, like, hey, understand commander's intent.
Yes, right.
And
right.
The mission side. I mean, that's what I was taking away from what you were saying.
No, that's exactly. Yeah, you've got to understand the commander's intent, and then ensuring that it's just not you understanding the commander's intent, right? That's the important piece to take away. Like, you're not controlling or hoarding the information. You've got to share the information, because for you to be successful, everyone needs to be successful, and vice versa. So we always talk about mission command. So how do you make that? How do you actually operationalize that, right? Mission command. So
I guess as we close it out, ma'am, is there a piece of advice that you would give yourself, 15 years ago, knowing what you know now today, and then are there any resources that you recommend for soldiers to, either use for development or whatever?
Yes. So I would say that ensure that you are prepared for what might come your way. Okay. And that is that you've done your basics, gone to school, making sure that you can, whether it's fire your weapon or run your ACFT, or making sure that those basics are complete and that you're prepared for that. But then also using those resources of that senior leader to ask them questions, because that is a true live piece of walking history textbook about, hey, what did this look like when you did it? What do you recommend? Where should I go next? And always seeking that feedback is important. And then when somebody tells you have a hole in your swing, to make sure you listen and then take that feedback and act on it. Sometimes it's hard to listen to that, but then we all have to do it, or we should do it. So I would recommend that as a young me, to making sure that when someone tells me I have a hole in my swing, action that and work on it, and that can make you a better officer.
Thank you, ma'am, for coming, and it was a pleasure having this conversation. I definitely learned a lot, and I know the audience did as well. So,
good. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
If you want more information on domestic operations or any of the topics we discussed today, please visit our social media pages in the links below. If you liked today's episode, don't forget to subscribe and leave us a 5-star review. You can find us wherever you listen to your favorite podcast.